These first few minutes in part 2 are very much what we covered in part 1. I'm using the X-Acto blade to add a little bit more texture and some highlights along with some erasers in the end of this beak. So while I'm doing that, I thought I would address a few comments that I got in part 1 that I thought were good. One comment asked for a list of the materials that I used, as well as my working air pressure and my reduction ratio. So I will add a list of all the materials I used in the description below, and I'll go back and add that in part 1 as well. The paint I'm using is actually Createx Illustration Colors, and you could do this with just the illustration black reduced to whatever ratio that you want to work with. I chose not to use just straight Createx Illustration black, and I didn't count exactly how many drops or anything when I mixed the color up, but I started with a 2-ounce cup, probably filled it about a quarter full with the Createx Illustration black, and then I dumped a lot of 4011 reducer, which is just a medium reducer, into it. It was probably about half full in that 2-ounce cup, which I'll tell you, I mixed up way more paint than I needed for this small portrait. But once I had it reduced, which was probably somewhere around 3-to-1, maybe 4-to-1, in that range, I added 2 drops of Createx Illustration White, and that's just to bring back a little bit of the opaque quality in the paint. It's not enough to gray out the black or anything like that. And then I also added 5 drops of Illustration Scarlet Red, just because I wanted a little bit warmer tone for this portrait. Once I actually started the painting process, the paint was still a little bit too thick. And keep in mind, I'm using a micron for this portrait, so it's a 0.15 millimeter needle and nozzle set. So I can work with a lot less air pressure than you can with other airbrushes with a larger nozzle and needle set. I started around 15 psi. I wasn't really happy with it. The airbrush wasn't spraying the paint quite correctly, and I wound up reducing it even further. In the end, I probably had somewhere around 7 or 8 parts reducer to 1 part paint. I also added a lot of transparent base, the Illustration transparent base, to the mix just to wash out the color. That way I could work with a very transparent or translucent color that allows me to build my values very slowly. You can tell when you watch me paint, I mean, this stuff, it doesn't cover really fast, and that's the way I like to work, because it's so easy to go darker, but once you go too dark, it's very hard to change that. So as far as my working pressure goes, I wound up going to about 8 psi in the end, and I found that to be kind of the happy place for me during this portrait. Another question I had was about posting the reference image that I'm using for this portrait somewhere where anybody could access it relatively easily if they wanted to paint this same portrait. At this point, I'm working on building a website, but that's going to take me a little bit. So if you are interested in painting this same portrait after watching this or while watching these videos, you're more than welcome to shoot me an email at wickedartstudio@gmail.com, and I will be more than happy to send you a good resolution photograph of this image, the exact same one that I used. So back to the painting, you just saw me use my aggressive pencil eraser to kind of erase one side of one of those landmarks that we painted with the use of our paper cut stencil. The reason behind that is that's a shadowed area underneath a feather, and it kind of tapers off. I didn't want that harsh line on the left side of that shadow. Now I'm kind of working in a little bit of darkness in this shadowed area that's underneath the beak and the eye area. You can see just a lot of little dagger strokes going on, and a few minutes ago I also kind of sketched out just the outline of one of the feathers on the right side of that shadow that we erased. But as I'm working in this shadowed area, you can see I'm using a lot of little dagger strokes, but I'm not necessarily trying to paint individual hairs or feathers or anything like that. This is very much the same approach that I use when I'm painting hair. You want to paint clumps of hair. Don't try to paint every single strand. If you do that, you kind of lose the effect. And there you see I just spidered my paint out again. I'm working with very, very thin paint, and even though I'm at about 8 psi, which is very low pressure, it's still very easy to blow this stuff out if you're not paying attention. That's not a big deal. That's going to be a very dark, shadowed area. I'm working it in slowly, building up my layers, because we'll have a few highlights in there that kind of show some feather texture. But overall, that area will be pretty dark. So now I've moved back up beneath the eye, and I'm doing the same thing, just kind of giving myself more of a roadmap for how this hair and feather texture moves. And here I've got a freehand shield. There's a very dark area in the reference right behind sort of that light mouth area. So in order to keep that mouth area that we have very clean right now, I'll just throw a shield up there and put me a dark spot right behind it. And it looks like I spidered the paint out there too. But again, that's no big deal. I can take the eraser, clean that up. And some of that will get buried in a lot of the blade work and the eraser work that will come after we lay down a little bit of color. Again, I'm working in layers here. Just I'll add a little bit of color, which gives me enough contrast so that when I go in with the erasers and the X-Acto blades, that you can actually see what paint I'm removing. Looking at the reference, there's also actually a really dark line right behind the mouth there that I just kind of filled in. I don't know, it's almost like a cheek. And now we've come up back into this area that kind of transitions from the feather and hair texture into the beak area. And I said in part one, if you look at the reference, these fine little hairs pretty much go in all directions. So again, it's very important to pay attention to your reference. You want to make sure that you've got the flow right, because if you don't, it'll just ruin the effect. So I'm spraying, I put a light shade of color or a light tone of color down, and now I'm going in with dots and various little dagger strokes. There's also a pretty shaded area there right in front of the eye that I just filled in a little bit. And some of these dagger strokes will be very small and fine because I'm trying to illustrate or make it believable that these are little hairs. But we'll refine that over and over again with the use of all these different tools that we've already used in part one. Here I brought in the Helix eraser just to kind of clean up that mouth area of the beak. Again, in the reference, that's very, very white. It's very light shade. Now I've come in with the X-Acto knife, the number 11 blade again, and you'll see me start scratching in some of these very fine hairs in that area that we just laid all that paint down. And by working in these layers like this, that's what makes it believable, in my opinion. You get some really neat effects. Back to the airbrush, again, just a very light shade or a very light tone of paint. And now I'm working on that. There's just a partial dark line that runs around the outside of the eye, and then on that inner portion it's a very light shade when you look at the reference. So I'm just redefining part of that line, and then there's a very small portion of it, pretty much dead center, just below the eye before it kind of fades out. There I just spidered the paint again, and you saw me wipe. I don't know what it is, but my first reaction is always to try and wipe that away. which is it's a really bad habit to get into, because if you do have time to wipe it away when the paint is wet, you really make a mess, and it makes it a lot harder to fix. But you saw I brought in the aggressive pencil eraser and just wiped that right away. It's not a big deal at all. So now I've come back in with the X-Acto blade, and you'll see me kind of move all the way around the Bristol board as I'm scratching these in, because I said before, the number 11 blades, they tend to scratch better in one direction than they do in the other. And because all of these fine little hairs are going in multiple different directions, it's a little bit easier to rotate around most of the time. At least I had a camera sitting on a tripod directly in front of me, so I had to kind of work around that, which made it a little bit of a challenge. But you can see just how fine these little hairs I'm scratching out are with that X-Acto blade. It's very precise when it comes to making very small, minute details. It works great. And you want to be very careful when you're doing a lot of detail like this and not go overboard. When you look at the reference image, you can tell, although it's not a super high resolution image, you can tell by looking at it there's a lot of detail in this area. There's a lot of little bitty fine hairs, but you still want to use the less is more approach. I'll put a lot of scratch marks in here and a lot of paint work in here. Just be careful. There's kind of a fine line. Most of the time when you're trying to paint something super detailed like this with a lot of detail in it, all you really need is just kind of the suggestion of what's going on. The human brain will put it together in the end. And you'll see I spend an awful lot of time in the eye area and the beak area, because that's my primary focus for this piece. The rest of it is kind of just like a filler in my eyes. I won't put quite as much detail into the top of the head, the rear portion where all the feathers are really well defined in the image, and below the beak in that shadowed area. We'll throw a little bit of detail in there, but my primary focus is the beak and the eye area. That's what I really want people to focus on when they see this. So again, I'm coming in and kind of cleaning up the mouth area on the beak. As I said, when you look at the reference, it's a very, very light shade, almost white. And in the end, in my painting, I will just primarily keep it white. But when you look at the reference, there's also, at the front of the beak, the feathers below it are quite a bit lighter, but there's a very dark area in between two light areas. So in order to protect and keep the beak clean, I've grabbed a freehand shield, and I'm going to start putting in just a suggestion of that darker area, which when you look at the reference, the beak outline is pretty crisp. It's very sharp in the photograph, so that's why I'm also using a shield rather than just going in and erasing after the fact. This makes it a little bit faster. I won't have to erase anything unless I screw it up, and I'll get that sharp line, and then we can come back in with the erasers and the blades and work on the texture. And it looks like I probably just spidered the paint out yet again. But you'll see I'm coming down with a few little dagger strokes, just a suggestion of some of that hair. There, I just spidered it out on the freehand shield. You got to be careful with the freehand shields too, because the paint is actually easier to oversaturate and spider out on the shield itself than it is on what you're painting normally. So now working below the beak, there's a pretty dark area just below the lighter shade of kind of fur and feather texture. So I'll start to kind of work that in with just some little dagger strokes. And these pretty much go right into the background and fade out until you get to kind of the lower portion, about where I am now. There's just a hint of some really lighter hair texture there, almost like it's got a backlight, and we'll work that in with an eraser later. But again, I'm not trying to paint individual hairs or feathers or strands. I'm looking at all this as shapes or clumps, whatever works for you. I don't generally look at things in different shapes, but that does help some people. I just look at the darkest areas, those are my clumps, and then the lighter areas are more clumps, and you just add, like I said a minute ago, just suggestions of detail. That's really all you need, and our brain will tie it all together in the end. And like I said before too, this is more filler in my view anyway. I want the real focus to be on the eye and the beak area when people see this. Now I'll work in just a light shade of color in this chest area, and in the reference, this area is very light, and there's really pretty minimal detail in the reference in this area, but this light tone will give me a little bit of contrast to work off of, because I'll come in with an eraser very minimally later and add some other little details here and there in that area. And now I will bounce over to one of the darker registration marks we made in the beginning with the paper cut stencil. I think I said before that I tend to bounce around a lot. I get bored working on something, so I'll bounce off into another direction. And that's just what works for me. Find what works for you. If you prefer to stay in one area, that's great. And now I'm going to come back up to the beak and start scratching in some more of this very fine hair texture. Remember to use very light pressure with a blade. You don't want to dig into your paper. I'm working on Strathmore 500 series Bristol, so it's just a paper surface. It's a pretty thick paper, and I've prepped it. I don't like to paint on paper out of the box, so to speak. I prep it with a little bit of paint before I actually begin painting on it. Now I'm going to use a freehand shield to just define the very top edge of the eagle's head. You see, I didn't put a very long line there, but I used a stencil to give myself a sharp line, and now I'm coming in with a freehand stroke to finish it off towards the beak. I said in part one, I think it adds to the realistic effect when you use multiple tools. I like that sharp line right next to a freehand line that may not be quite so sharp or appear a little bit out of focus. In my opinion, I think that really makes a huge difference in my work. And sometimes it'll leave other people guessing when they look at it. They're like, well, how did he do that? Now I'm kind of working in a little bit of freehand on the top, and then I'm going to come back in with, oddly enough, the bird stencil. And just a very light coat of paint, and you see how that defines the top of the seagull's head. And that's a little bit dark, and it comes down a little bit too far, but we can clean that up with erasers and maybe even the blade here in just a little bit. But I said in part one, the top of that eagle's head really needs to go a little bit darker to make it stand out more from the background. So Now I'm coming up and just using a few little dagger strokes and another light wash of color to push some of those highlights that we created in part one back. And then we'll come in with erasers and probably the blade and add another layer. So although we've pushed those highlights we created before back, you can still see them. We're not erasing those with paint. We're just building layers. And there's a dark line right in front of that really shadowed area in front of the eye that I just came in with, and then there's a really dark spot right above it. Which, looking at the reference now, I think I was just a hair off on where I put that spot, but that's okay. Again, I'm not trying to paint this exactly like the reference, and in the end you'll see it's actually not like the reference at all, especially when I get to the feathered area on the back side. I wanted a realistic effect, but I'm not trying to go for photorealism. I can appreciate the photorealism stuff. I think it's awesome, and I know how much time and effort it takes to do that, but at the end of the day, I still like my paintings to look like a painting. And that's just my opinion. I'm not knocking anybody that does photorealistic stuff. It's amazing work. That's just my preference. So again, coming in with some short dagger strokes. Some are finer than others. Again, the top portion of this head, when you look at the reference, is a little bit out of focus. So I'm not going to add a ton of detail in this area. Just kind of want to build it enough. So back in with the X-Acto blade, and there are some pretty fine hairs right at the transition at the end of the beak where it goes into the feathers on the top of the head. You can see a suggestion of some very fine hairs in the reference. So I'm just trying to cut some of those in. And at that point right there that I'm working on, it looks like the beak actually comes in and it almost parts the feathers on top of the head. So you see the beak comes in and then you see the other side of the head. And I'll recreate that just by erasing a little bit of that overspray with an eraser later. But again, working very light touch here. We just want to remove the paint. We don't want to damage the surface we're working on. And it doesn't take very much effort to remove this paint, especially when you've just sprayed it. Adding just a few little details again above the eye, paying attention to the reference, the direction of this hair and texture flow. Now I've come back in with the Helix eraser, which you can see is probably rounded off pretty good after using it because it's erasing some pretty wide lines, which works well for this sort of out of focus portion of the painting. Again, just continuing to add some more of these highlights with the electric eraser. Some will be more crisp than others. And paying attention to the flow of, the hair and the feather texture in the reference is where all of this is coming from. And I know you can't see where the reference is posted for this painting, but it's immediately to my left, so all I have to do is glance over and that gives me all the information I need. And all this information that I'm putting into the painting comes directly from the reference. Again, I'm not trying to paint this exactly as I see it. It'll be close, but it's not, again, a photorealistic effort on my part. And there you saw with the Helix, I went up there and kind of erased some of that line that we made with the bird stencil to define the top of the head. and I think that looks much better. And there again, paying attention to the flow of the hair and the feather texture in the reference. Right above the eye on that brow, it comes down, but just slightly above it, it looks like it's going straight back. So those little details make a big difference in your work. I think that's starting to look pretty good. And again, every now and then it's good to throw in a line or two that are maybe going a totally different direction, the wrong way. It just adds to that realistic effect, in my opinion. And working over that shadowed area kind of behind the eye, and back in with the airbrush. Again, darkening up some of that area directly under the brow. That's a very shadowed area in the reference. And again, there's that little bit of a shadowed area directly in front of the eyeball. Again, working in very small dots here. I'm not trying to lay a very smooth tone out. I like the texture. Adding a little bit of a shadow in the top of the eye. On both sides, and there's actually a secondary highlight in the reference on the back side of the eyeball that we'll add in with an eraser once I get some more paint in that area. And there you see again more little dots. So not only am I adding a shadow, but I'm adding texture at the same time. And then we'll come back in with erasers and the X-Acto blade and further refine and add more texture to that area. Again, I spend a lot of time in this area here, the eyeball and the beak, because that's what I want to be the primary focus in the end when this painting is finished. Continually darkening that area up just a little bit at a time. Again, it's so easy to darken an area up if you need to, but once you go too dark, it becomes a lot more difficult to repair that. There you saw I just put a light tone or light shade of color over all those highlights that we just put in the top of the head. Again, pushing those highlights back just a little bit. You could still see them just fine. Just pushing them back ever so slightly so that we can come in with even more highlights to add more depth to the piece. And now I'm coming in with some darker dagger strokes. In the reference, there's some very darker lines at the rear of the beak where the beak and the feathers meet. But I don't see so many as you go further back. So I'll add some of these darker lines towards the front, and then the back will remain more of a mid-tone, even in the shadowed areas. A few little darker areas, just a little bit further behind the eye, but not very many up on top of the head. Again, putting a very light wash at the rear of the beak, and that will give me the contrast I need when I come back in with the X-Acto knife and even the erasers later to develop some more of that hair texture that's kind of going in all different directions. And you see I'm coming over some of the hair texture that we've already created with the X-Acto blade with just that very light wash of color. Again, that just adds to the layers. And I added a very light shade of color into the eyeball itself. And now I've decided to move back down into this shadowed area underneath the beak. which again, in the end, this will be very, very dark, but I build it up very slowly. I'm trying to work in the very darkest areas I see in the reference first, and then we'll use erasers and the blade to just add a little bit of that hair or feather texture in there. Very subtle. Like I said before, it's just suggestions of that hair and feather texture in there. That's really all you need. And again, I'm working in dagger strokes here, and rather than just washing the color on to darken all this up, because that adds to that hair and feather texture in the end. But I'm still not trying to render individual hairs or feathers. I just want the look, the feel of that effect. And hopefully this will pull it off nicely. When you see me pull the airbrush out of frame, there's normally a number of reasons why I do that. When I went through and edited all this out, I probably had about 6 hours worth of footage, and some of that time, I think I said in part one, I'll stand back 6 to 10 feet and just look at it and see if anything needs to be adjusted or decide where I want to go next, whether I think it's dark enough or it needs to go darker. Sometimes I'm just cleaning tip dry off the end of the needle. Again, still working in these very dark areas. There's a lot of lighter hairs in the area that I'm at right now, so I'm just putting some light tone, a few little dots, a few little dagger strokes, and then we'll come in with the erasers and the blade to further refine some of that hair texture and make it a little bit more believable. But this is really kind of coming together pretty well at this point, I think. Again, I mentioned before that there's a darker area directly underneath the mouth there that goes into a lighter area, so I'm kind of defining the outside of the lighter area, which is quite a bit darker, with some rough dagger strokes. Again, this is all kind of, I'm mapping things out before I commit and go too dark, really. I'm working in a little bit of the shading and the texture in the lower end of the beak. It's very subtle when you look in the reference, but there is some just hints of texture, and it gradually gets lighter as it gets to kind of the area where the feathers meet the lower part of the beak. So again, it's just little dots is primarily all I'm spraying to create that texture, and then I come in with the Helix eraser, and that light line that goes up in the top end of the beak that I said in part one actually travels down into the lower half. I'm just cleaning that up and kind of redefining that line. It may have been a little bit wide when I painted it in with the airbrush, so I'd come in with the eraser and thin it out if needed. Now back into the top of the beak, redefining some of these highlights. Again, same thing I do with the airbrush with the eraser, is just erasing a lot of little dots. And with the X-Acto blade, I can come in and really define some of these details with a lot of precision. Still using a very light touch. I don't want to damage the paper. I'm just trying to remove a little bit of paint at a time. And you can see how I've thinned that line up quite a bit with both the eraser and the blade. And I really think that working on smaller scale projects like this really helps you to develop your fundamental control when it comes to airbrushing. And working on smaller scale projects is not easy. It can be very frustrating at times too, but it ultimately will help you develop better control of your airbrush. I liken it a lot to firearms. If you're into shooting, if you shoot at smaller targets from longer distances, that will improve your shooting abilities. It's kind of the same thing when it comes to airbrushing. And I'm not suggesting that you should work on smaller scale projects all the time, but every now and then challenge yourself. And even if you don't have complete control of the airbrush, sometimes the airbrush just doesn't react the way that you want it to anyway. You've seen me make multiple mistakes in this video series already. If you get a line that's too thick, it's not that big a deal. You can use an eraser or a blade to thin it back down. There are a number of ways that you can repair mistakes, and that's one of the things that you need to learn. It's something that I struggled with a lot for quite a few years when I started airbrushing, because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. There were a number of times that I just threw something away or painted over it and started all over because I didn't know how to repair the mistakes. Well, repairing mistakes is part of the learning process. They're going to happen. They still happen to me. I've been doing this for close to 30 years now. It's just part of it. Although it's frustrating, don't try not to let it frustrate you, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to learn how to fix those mistakes, because they will happen. So I'm coming back in with the blade now and working on more of this hair texture. Again, the contrast from that light tone of color that we put down just a few minutes ago gives me plenty to be able to see all these little fine hairs that we're scratching in now. And you can see that some of these I've even taken over the mouth and down into the lower portion underneath the beak, because I think I can see, like I said, the reference photo isn't super high resolution. It's not an absolute great photograph, but I think I see a few of those that probably traveled down that far. So, and even if they don't, it's still, this is my artwork. I can do what I want, and you can do the same thing. I think it just, again, adds a little bit more to the realism of the piece. And again, remember not to try to go overboard with all this. I'm putting in a lot of detail here, but you don't want to completely erase that light tone of color that we have there either. If you do that, then none of this is going to show up. But you can see they're going in multiple different directions. It's almost a spiral effect in this area. Pay attention to your reference again. I can't emphasize that enough. It's very important to pull off that realistic effect. Even if you're not going for a realistic effect, you want to paint what you see, not what you think you know. And that's been a saying around for years and years and years, but it's so true. Regardless of what you're doing, whether you're painting with paintbrushes or drawing with pencils or using an airbrush, always pay attention to your reference and try to recreate what you see in that reference. Now I'm coming in with the Helix eraser and kind of blending some of those lines out. I don't want all of that to be super sharp, very precise, crisp lines. There I'm redefining the highlight at the top of the beak, and I'll eventually pull that back into those feathered areas. I talked about that earlier, how it almost parts the feathers. And now I'm kind of defining that area a little bit better. But the Helix, going over all those fine, precise hairlines that we made with the X-Acto knife, will kind of fade some of those out, blend them in. It gives it a little bit of an out of focus look. And that's somewhat represented in the reference photo. Again, lots of little dots with this eraser too. I'm not trying to create more hairlines with it. I'm just kind of blending all of that together. Now I've switched to the aggressive pencil eraser. Again, just redefining that highlight on the top of the beak, which it stands out pretty good now against the very light background. You know, the background is super, super light, but it stands out nicely against it. Back in with the blade. Again, this area just below and around the bottom half of the eyeball is very light in the reference. So I'm kind of cleaning up a little bit of that area, and again, just adding very fine lines as suggestions of all those little hairs or feather texture. Adding just a hint of texture into the outer portion of the eyeball now. The eyeball in the reference is really not extremely well defined with detail. It's very subtle details in the eyeball, so I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time in there. Now I've finally come in and decided to scratch in the highlights at the front of the eyeball. I'll actually come in with an eraser, the Helix eraser, later and redefine those again, make them a little bit broader and not quite so crisp as what the X-Acto blade gave us. And lightening up some of these areas in the beak, trying to help that transition from the darker area into the lighter area. When you look at the reference, there's a really nice transition there. Now I've come back in with the number 10 blade, which again, you won't see this blade very often. I probably needed to change the blade. I think this one's pretty dull. I've had it on that particular knife for quite a while. Coming in with the airbrush again, reestablishing or redefining some of the highlight up there in the brow area, and now adding just a very faint little detail in the middle of the iris. I'm sorry, not the iris, the outer portion of the eye. Because looking at the reference, there's just, it looks like a very faint line kind of runs around the outside of the iris. And that's really pretty much all the detail that I'll put into the eyeball itself, other than some more shading. Again, working in those shadowed areas, one right in front of the eye. And this will also help to push back some of those fine little hair detail that we added with the X-Acto blade. which I will rework again, probably with the blade at least one more time, just to get that depth and the realistic effect. That's what I'm after. Again, not going for photorealism here, but I want a realistic effect. So you see there again, I'm coming in with lots of little dots and a few little dagger strokes here and there, just adding additional texture, building texture with both the airbrush and with the erasers and the X-Acto blades. And again, that's where all that detail, the depth in your work comes from. You got to work those layers in. You know, it didn't look bad where it was at just a few minutes ago, but I know it can look even better if I just spend a little bit more time. I'm not saying you should spend an enormous amount of time. You can spend as much time as you want on your own artwork. In total, I had maybe 5 or 6 hours in this, which is not bad for a 5x7 inch piece. If it had been larger, it would have taken a little bit less time because I don't have to worry about being quite so precise. You're working on larger scale. It generally takes a shorter period of time. Again, working in some of that lighter hair texture that you see in the reference. With the blade, and you can see it just with all those layers. I think it just adds to it. And you may think that it doesn't, and that's okay. Again, it's your work. Find what works for you. I'm just showing you guys the methods that I use. Take what you want, change what you want. In the end, it's all about what you like, what you want to accomplish with your own artwork. Again, redefining some of these highlights above the eye and in the top of the head. Just very subtle. Again, not less is more. If you're at all interested in why I'm actually painting this particular piece, I'm a member of airbrushforum.org, and every now and then they will do what they call a paint pal. And all it is anyone that wants to participate is free to volunteer regardless of what level you're at. And you send your name and address to one of the administrators, and that administrator will randomly pair you up with another artist from the forum. And that's why this is a small scale. You're limited to a 5-inch by 7-inch, nothing larger than that, canvas, because in the end, when you're finished with your painting, you mail it to the person that was selected to be your paint pal. So I have no idea who's painting something for me until I receive it, and the person that I'm painting this for had no idea until they received it. So it's kind of a cool way to share your art with others, and it's a neat deal, I think. This one actually wound up going to the UK. I'm not extremely active on the forum. I just don't have the time, but I jump on there every now and then, and I try to help others when I can. There's some insanely talented people on that forum, and there's every level. You've got people that are just starting out and people that have been doing this for years and years and years, and everybody is extremely helpful. It's a great place to get some good advice at times when you need it. But you can see I'm coming in with the Helix electric eraser again and adding some more highlights in the top of the eagle's head. And I think the front portion of the top of the head is looking pretty good at this point, that we're nearing the end for adding some of these details there. Just need some more highlights, and I'll probably come down and widen out some of those fine little hairs right above the eye on the brow, just to give it that more of a out of focus look. Those hairs are very, very crisp that we put in there with the X-Acto blade. There we go. And again, paying attention to the reference, looking at the direction that this hair and feather texture flows. And it's amazing the effects you can get just by removing a little bit of paint. I'm coming back in and redefining a little bit of a highlight in between the eye and that shadowed area, as well as working on that lighter area I've talked about. It's kind of a ring around the eye of very light, feathery texture. Now with my aggressive pencil eraser, I'm going to work on fading that dark shadowed area out just a little bit. And then we can work on making that transition a little bit better with the airbrush by adding just a little bit more paint. And at this point, I'm working on that very dark ring that goes around the eye. And you'll notice when I paint this, I'm using a series of very small dots rather than doing just a single line going across the bottom of that eye. I just think that adds to the realism of the piece. It gives a little bit of texture there. You know, nature is chaotic. It's not contrived. You don't see a lot of fine, just straight lines, especially in wildlife or in portraiture in general. I'm working in some more of that very fine line that goes around the iris in the eye. And again, that's pretty much all the detail that the eye itself will get, other than some more shading. The right side of the eye is quite a bit lighter than the left. Again, that dark area just below the very light area of feathers under the eye. There's one more little piece right there where I'm working, and that's probably a little bit wide for what I want, but that's okay. We can come in with either the X-Acto blade or the erasers and minimize that mistake. Some small dagger strokes just to give the feel of some hair and furry texture or feathery texture, whatever the case may be. I'm not really sure if these are all technically feathers, or I think some of it's hair by looking at the reference, but I'm not a wildlife expert. Working in the shadow on the right side of the eye, which again, there's a secondary highlight when you look at the reference up there, but we'll come back in with an eraser and add that in. And now I need to get the right side of the eye, that ring that goes around it, as dark as it needs, which is pretty much straight black. The iris and that ring around the eye are pretty well the darkest portions of this entire painting. Again, just working on some of this furry, hairy, feathery texture with multiple little dots. I'm back with the Helix Eraser. Again, I said the very right side of the eye is quite a bit lighter than the rest of the eye when you look at the reference. There we'll add the highlight, the secondary highlight, which is too stark at this point, but we'll come back in with the airbrush and mute that ever so slightly. Again, just some fine details with that X-Acto blade. And this is really starting to come together now. It's really looking nice. But there's still a lot of work to do. I don't think I'm finished with that fine texture in between the eye and the beak at this point. There you saw with the Helix, I just came in and redefined the highlight on the left side of the eye. Made it a little bit wider, not quite as sharp as what we had from using the X-Acto blade before. And now with the X-Acto blade, I'm just working in some of that hair texture and back to the airbrush. Again, muting that secondary highlight on the right side of the eye. So I hope watching this in real time gives you guys a better understanding of how much time and effort I actually spend in certain areas in a painting. I know this is not super exciting to watch. It's time consuming. But I think taking that extra time and effort, working things back and forth in multiple layers, really pays off in the end with the effect that you get in your finished painting. So if you take nothing else away from these videos, take away that spending the extra time to do things well really pays off. We're obviously not going to be able to finish this painting up in part 2. There's still a lot of work left to do on this, but I hope you guys have got something out of this. And if you did, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. And we'll continue in part 3. I'll see you guys then.